Have you ever wondered what happens when duty collides with conscience in the most impossible circumstances? When a single act of mercy could cost you everything you hold dear, yet your heart refuses to turn away from human suffering? Tonight, I want to share with you a story that will challenge everything you think you know about courage, compassion, and the choices we make when the world has lost its way. Picture this. It's March 1943, and the city of Paris lies under the iron grip of Nazi occupation. Every street corner holds a checkpoint. Every shadow could hide an informant. Every act of kindness toward the wrong person could mean death. In this world of fear and suspicion, where humanity itself has become a dangerous luxury, something extraordinary is about to unfold in the quiet corridors of a convent hospital. This is the story of Sister Marie Clare, a 32-year-old nun whose life was dedicated to healing the sick and serving God. She had taken in her vows 7 years earlier, believing her path was clear and unwavering. But war has a way of rewriting even the most carefully planned destinies, and on a cold March morning, Sister Marie Clare would face a choice that would test every principle she held sacred. What makes this story so remarkable isn't just the impossible circumstances that brought these two souls together. It's what their encounter reveals about the power of individual conscience to triumph over the machinery of hatred. This isn't just another war story. This is a testament to the moment when one person's decision to see humanity before uniform would change two lives forever. The convent of Sainte Marguerite sat like a fortress of faith in the heart of occupied Paris. Its ancient stone walls had witnessed centuries of devotion, but never anything quite like what was about to unfold within them. The convent had been converted into a hospital during the early days of the occupation, its spacious halls and countless rooms transformed into wards for the wounded. The Mother Superior, recognizing that their calling to heal transcended politics, had opened their doors to anyone who needed medical care. Sister Marie Clare moved through the hospital with quiet efficiency that morning, checking on patients whose wars had brought them to this sacred place. Her hands, calloused from years of tending to the sick, carried a gentleness that could soothe even the most tormented souls. She had trained at the prestigious Salpêtrière before taking her vows, and her medical skills were respected by doctors throughout Paris. The wounded filled every available bed. French civilians injured in bombing raids lay beside captured resistance fighters. Allied airmen shot down over the countryside recovered in rooms next to German soldiers wounded in partisan attacks. In this place, pain recognized no uniform, no flag, no political allegiance. The sisters had made a sacred promise to treat anyone who came seeking help, regardless of which side of the conflict they represented. Sister Marie Clare understood the delicate balance they maintained. The German authorities tolerated the convent hospital because it served their wounded as well as others. The French resistance respected it because the nuns asked no questions and kept no records that could endanger their patients. This neutrality was purchased with constant vigilance and careful diplomacy, but it allowed them to continue their mission of healing in a world gone mad. The morning routine began like any other. Sister Marie Clare distributed medications to patients in the East Wing, changed bandages in the surgical recovery ward, and assisted Dr. Dubois with his rounds. The elderly physician had been working at the convent since the occupation began, his own medical practice having been destroyed in the early bombing of Paris. Together, they had developed systems for treating wounds that would have challenged the finest military hospitals. The sound of vehicles approaching through the morning mist shattered the peaceful routine. Heavy boots echoed in the courtyard as a German medical convoy arrived with fresh casualties. Sister Marie Clare watched from the window as stretchers were unloaded, each one carrying another broken body that would need their care and compassion. She had learned not to count the wounded anymore. The numbers had become too overwhelming to contemplate. Among the injured was a German officer whose condition immediately caught her attention. Major Hans Weber had been wounded during a resistance attack on a supply convoy outside the city. Shrapnel from a grenade had torn through his left shoulder and chest, leaving him unconscious and bleeding heavily. The field medics had done what they could, but he needed surgery if he was going to survive the next few hours. Sister Marie Clare helped transfer the Major to the emergency treatment room, her trained eye assessing his injuries with professional detachment. The wounds were serious, but not necessarily fatal if treated properly. She could see that he was young, perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of face that spoke of intelligence and sensitivity, rather than the hard brutality she had expected from Nazi officers. Dr. Dubois examined the patient with the same thorough attention he gave to everyone who came through their doors. The shrapnel had missed the major arteries, but infection was already setting in from the delay in treatment. They would need to operate immediately, cleaning the wounds and removing the metal fragments before gangrene could take hold. As they prepared for surgery, Sister Marie Clare found herself studying the unconscious officer's face. There was something about his features that seemed familiar, though she was certain they had never met. Perhaps it was simply that he reminded her of her younger brother, who had been killed at Dunkirk 3 years earlier. The resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable, and it stirred emotions she had thought she had buried with her grief. The operation lasted 3 hours. Sister Marie Clare assisted Dr. Dubois with the precision that came from years of working together in the most challenging conditions. They removed 7 pieces of shrapnel from the Major's shoulder and chest, cleaned and sutured the wounds, and administered the precious antibiotics they kept for the most serious cases. Throughout the procedure, the patient remained unconscious, his breathing steady but labored. When they finally wheeled him to the recovery ward, Sister Marie Clare couldn't shake the feeling that this case would be different from the hundreds of others she had treated. Something about the Major's quiet dignity, even in unconsciousness, the way his hands remained unclenched despite his pain, suggested a man whose character didn't match the uniform he wore. The recovery ward occupied what had once been the convent's library, its tall windows providing natural light that aided healing. 20 beds lined the walls, most occupied by patients in various stages of recovery. Sister Marie Clare placed the Major in a bed near the window, where the morning sun would help warm him as his body fought to heal itself. For the first 2 days, Major Weber remained unconscious, his fever rising and falling as his body battled the infection that threatened to claim his life. Sister Marie Clare checked on him every few hours, monitoring his temperature, adjusting his medications, and ensuring his wounds remained clean and properly dressed. She spoke to him softly as she worked, a habit she had developed with all her unconscious patients, believing somehow that her voice might reach them even in their darkness. It was on the 3rd morning that everything changed. Sister Marie Clare was checking the Major's temperature when his eyes suddenly opened, focusing on her face with surprising clarity. For a moment, neither of them moved, both aware that something significant was happening between them that transcended the categories of nun and patient, French and German, ally and enemy. The Major tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. Sister Marie Clare leaned closer, straining to understand words spoken in accented French that revealed careful education rather than military barking. He was thanking her, she realized, expressing gratitude for the care he had received, while acknowledging that he understood how dangerous it might be for her to help a German officer. Sister Marie Clare found herself looking into eyes that held no trace of the fanaticism she had been taught to expect from Nazi officers. Instead, she saw exhaustion, confusion, and something that looked remarkably like shame. This was not the face of a man who believed wholeheartedly in the cause he had been fighting for. This was someone who seemed as bewildered by the circumstances of his life as she was by her unexpected reaction to his presence. Over the following days, as Major Weber's strength slowly returned, they began to communicate in fragments of conversation that revealed far more than either had intended to share. He told her about his background as a literature professor at the University of Munich, how he had been drafted into military service despite his reservations about the war. She shared her own story of choosing religious life over the comfortable bourgeois existence her wealthy family had planned for her. These conversations, conducted in whispers during the quiet hours when other patients slept, began to reveal the human being behind the uniform that had initially defined him in her mind. The major spoke of books they had both read, of philosophical questions that had troubled him long before the war began, of dreams for a peaceful world that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve. Sister Marie Clare discovered that Major Weber carried a small book of poetry in his jacket pocket, verses by Rilke and Goethe that he had memorized during his university years. When she mentioned her own love of literature, his face lit up with the first genuine smile she had seen since his arrival. They began sharing favorite passages, finding in poetry a common language that transcended their supposed differences. The danger of their growing connection became apparent as the days passed. Other patients in the ward began to notice the attention Sister Marie Clare paid to the German officer. Some watched with curiosity, others with concern, a few with barely concealed anger at what they saw as misplaced sympathy for someone who wore the uniform of their oppressors. Mother Superior Marguerite was not blind to these developments. She had shepherded young nuns through spiritual crises for over 20 years, and she recognized the signs of a soul in turmoil. But the nature of this particular struggle was something she had never encountered before. How does one counsel a sister whose heart has been captured by someone who should be her enemy? The confrontation came on a quiet Thursday evening when the last of the day shift had departed and the night watch had not yet begun their rounds. Mother Superior found Sister Marie Clare sitting beside Major Weber's bed, reading aloud from a book of French poetry while he listened with obvious pleasure. The scene was intimate in a way that made the older woman's heart contract with both understanding and fear. The conversation that followed was conducted in the Mother Superior's private office, away from curious ears and watching eyes. Her words were gentle but firm, acknowledging Sister Marie Clare's dedication while making clear that the situation developing between nun and patient could not continue without consequences that would threaten not just her own safety, but the safety of everyone in the convent. Sister Marie Clare listened with the respect due to her superior, but something had awakened in her heart that could not easily be suppressed. She had spent 7 years believing that her love for God was complete and sufficient for her needs. Now she discovered feelings that seemed to complement rather than compete with her religious devotion, as if caring for this wounded man had opened new chambers in her heart rather than closing old ones. Meanwhile, Major Weber was experiencing his own crisis of conscience and identity. The kindness he had received from Sister Marie Clare and the other nuns forced him to confront questions about duty and morality that he had been avoiding since his conscription. How could he continue to serve an army that represented everything these compassionate women opposed? How could he return to a war that created the very suffering they worked so tirelessly to heal? The weeks that followed would test both of them in ways neither had imagined possible, as their impossible connection deepened despite every rational argument against it. The medical charts told only part of Major Weber's story. Sister Marie Clare had learned to read between the lines of official documentation, understanding that behind every entry lay a human being, whose wounds extended far beyond the physical. As she reviewed his file during her evening rounds, she noticed details that painted a picture of someone who had been changed by his experiences in ways that military records could never capture. His sleep was troubled by nightmares that left him calling out in German, words she couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear in the anguish that contorted his features. She had seen this before in other soldiers, both German and Allied, men whose minds carried scars that no surgery could heal. But with Major Weber, she found herself staying longer beside his bed during these episodes, her presence somehow calming the demons that haunted his dreams. The other patients in the ward had begun to form their own opinions about the German officer who spoke softly and read poetry. Some maintained their distance, viewing him with suspicion that was both understandable and expected. Others, particularly the older men who had served in the previous war, seemed to recognize in him a fellow sufferer rather than an enemy. War had taught them that pain was universal, that the capacity for suffering transcended national boundaries. Dr. Dubois had noticed the unusual dynamic developing around his German patient. The elderly physician had treated countless wounded over his long career, and he understood that healing involved more than medical intervention. The human connections formed in times of crisis often proved as therapeutic as any medication. Yet he also recognized the dangerous territory that Sister Marie Clare was entering, both professionally and personally. The conversation he initiated with her one morning was carefully worded but unmistakably clear in its implications. He spoke of the delicate balance they maintained at the convent hospital, the trust they had built with both German authorities and French civilians. Any appearance of favoritism or improper conduct could destroy the sanctuary they had created for all who needed their care. Sister Marie Clare understood his concerns, but she found herself unable to treat Major Weber with the clinical detachment that medical protocol demanded. Something about his quiet dignity, his obvious intelligence, and the pain that went deeper than his physical wounds called to aspects of her nature that had nothing to do with her religious vows or professional training. The Major's recovery progressed more slowly than his injuries alone would have suggested. The infection had been conquered, the wounds were healing cleanly, but his spirit seemed reluctant to embrace the prospect of returning to active duty. Sister Marie Clare recognized in him the same struggle she had observed in other soldiers who had seen too much, experienced too much, lost too much, to continue believing in the cause they were supposed to serve. Their conversations during his convalescence revealed layers of complexity that challenged every assumption Sister Marie Clare had held about German soldiers and Nazi ideology. Major Weber spoke of his students at the university, young minds hungry for knowledge and understanding rather than propaganda and hatred. He described colleagues who had been dismissed or arrested for refusing to conform to political orthodoxy, friends who had disappeared into the machinery of state terror. The poetry they shared became a bridge between their different worlds, a language that spoke to universal human experiences rather than national divisions. When Major Weber recited verses from memory, his voice carried an emotion that revealed the depth of his inner conflict. These were not the words of a fanatic or a true believer, but of someone who had found refuge in beauty and meaning during the darkest chapters of human history. Sister Marie Clare began bringing books from the convent's collection, volumes that had survived the conversion to hospital use. They read together during the quiet afternoon hours, discussing themes and ideas that had nothing to do with war or politics. Literature became their sanctuary, a place where they could exist as simply two intelligent people sharing thoughts and insights rather than representatives of opposing sides in a conflict neither had chosen. The transformation in both of them did not go unnoticed by those around them. Sister Marie Clare moved through her duties with a new energy that seemed to come from some inner source of joy she had never possessed before. Her smile came more easily, her laughter rang through the wards more frequently, and her already considerable compassion seemed to deepen and expand to embrace everyone in her care. Major Weber's own change was equally remarkable. The haunted look that had marked his features during his first weeks at the convent gradually gave way to something approaching peace. He began participating in conversations with other patients, sharing observations about literature and philosophy that revealed the teacher he had been before the war transformed him into a soldier. The German medical officers who visited the convent to check on their wounded personnel noticed these changes with mixed reactions. Some appreciated the excellent care their men received at the hands of the French nuns, understanding that such treatment was both rare and valuable in wartime. Others viewed any signs of friendship or comfort with suspicion, wondering if French sympathy might be undermining German military discipline. Captain Muller, the senior German medical officer responsible for overseeing treatment at civilian hospitals, paid particular attention to Major Weber's case. His recovery had been exemplary from a medical standpoint, yet he seemed strangely reluctant to return to active duty. The captain's questions during his visits were carefully phrased but clearly designed to assess whether the major's loyalties had been compromised by his extended stay among the French. Sister Marie Clare sensed the increasing scrutiny and understood that their time together was approaching an end. The Major's wounds had healed sufficiently to allow his return to military service, and no medical justification remained for extending his convalescence. The reality of their situation pressed down upon both of them like a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. The conversations they shared during what they both knew were their final weeks together took on an urgency that had been absent before. They spoke not just of books and ideas, but of dreams and fears, of the people they had been before the war and the people they hoped to become when peace finally returned. These intimate exchanges revealed depths of connection that surprised both of them with their intensity. Major Weber told Sister Marie Clare about his childhood in Bavaria, the small town where his father had taught school, and his mother had tended a garden that bloomed with flowers she had never seen. He described university life before the Nazi Party's rise to power, when academic freedom had allowed for genuine intellectual exploration rather than ideological conformity. His voice carried a wistfulness that spoke of a world that seemed as distant as a fairy tale. Sister Marie Clare shared her own memories of life before her religious vows, the comfortable bourgeois household where she had been expected to marry well, and produce children who would continue the family's respectable traditions. She told him about the moment of calling that had led her to religious life, the sense of purpose she had found in serving God and caring for those who suffered. Yet, as she spoke, she found herself questioning whether that calling might be broader than she had previously understood. The spring weather brought changes to the rhythm of life at the convent hospital. Windows could be opened to let in fresh air that carried the scent of blooming flowers from the gardens the nuns maintained between the medical buildings. Patients who were strong enough could be moved outdoors for brief periods, their faces turning gratefully toward sunlight that seemed to promise renewal and hope. Major Weber was among those deemed well enough for outdoor privileges, and Sister Marie Clare often accompanied him during these carefully supervised excursions. They would sit in the garden courtyard, surrounded by the evidence of new life pushing through soil that had been frozen just weeks before. The metaphor was not lost on either of them as they contemplated their own unexpected flowering in circumstances that should have produced only animosity and suspicion. These outdoor conversations allowed them to speak more freely than the hospital wards permitted. Away from the constant presence of other patients and medical staff, they could explore topics that would have been impossible to discuss in more public settings. Major Weber revealed his growing doubts about the war and the ideology that justified it, admitting that his experiences at the convent had fundamentally challenged his understanding of duty and patriotism. Sister Marie Clare found herself sharing thoughts and feelings that she had never expressed to another human being. The conflict between her growing attachment to the Major and her religious vows created a tension that she struggled to understand or resolve. She had believed that love of God was sufficient for her spiritual needs, yet her connection to this wounded German officer seemed to open new dimensions of her capacity for compassion and understanding. The inevitable moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in early May when Captain Muller appeared at the convent with orders for Major Weber's immediate return to active duty. His medical file indicated complete recovery, and the German army needed experienced officers for the challenging campaigns that lay ahead. There would be no extensions, no delays, no appeals to medical necessity. Sister Marie Clare was changing bandages in the surgical ward when she heard the news. The simple announcement that Major Weber would be leaving that afternoon struck her like a physical blow, though she managed to maintain her professional composure until she could find privacy to process the magnitude of what was about to happen. The hours that followed passed in a blur of routine tasks performed with mechanical precision, while her mind reeled with the implications of their impending separation. She had known this moment would come, had tried to prepare herself for it. Yet the reality proved far more devastating than she had anticipated. The connection they had forged over weeks of shared conversations and growing intimacy was about to be severed by forces neither of them could control. Major Weber's own reaction to the news was complex and difficult to read. Part of him seemed relieved to finally escape the liminal space between military duty and civilian care that had defined his existence at the convent. Another part appeared genuinely distressed at the prospect of leaving behind the only place where he had found peace and understanding since the war began. Their final conversation took place in the garden where they had shared so many meaningful exchanges over the previous weeks. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as they sat together for what both understood would be the last time. The words they spoke carried weight that seemed to exceed their simple meaning, each phrase carefully chosen to convey feelings that could not be expressed directly. The transformation that had occurred in both of them during their time together would continue to influence their choices and perspectives long after their physical separation. The seeds of understanding and compassion that had been planted in the most unlikely circumstances would grow in ways that neither could predict, but both would carry forward into an uncertain future. Uncertain future. The weight of unspoken words hung between them like incense in the cathedral air. Sister Marie Clare watched as Major Weber struggled to find language for what they both felt, but could never openly acknowledge. The garden around them seemed to hold its breath, the afternoon light filtering through spring leaves that would soon witness the end of something neither had expected to find. Major Weber reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the small book of poetry that had become such an important part of their conversations. His fingers traced the worn leather cover as he spoke about the comfort these verses had provided during his darkest moments. Without words, he offered the book to Sister Marie Clare, their hands touching briefly as she accepted this precious gift that represented far more than mere literature. The gesture carried profound meaning that both understood without explanation. This was not simply the exchange of a book between patient and caregiver, but the passing of something sacred between two souls who had discovered unexpected kinship in the most impossible circumstances. The poetry that had bridged their different worlds would now serve as a tangible connection across whatever distance the war would place between them. Sister Marie Clare opened the book carefully, her eyes falling on handwritten notes in the margins where Major Weber had recorded his thoughts and reactions to various passages. His careful script revealed a mind that engaged deeply with ideas, someone who found in literature not mere entertainment, but sustenance for the spirit. She realized she was holding not just his book, but pieces of his inner life that he was entrusting to her care. The sound of military vehicles approaching through the convent gates reminded them that their time was measured in minutes rather than hours. Captain Muller's voice could be heard in the distance, issuing orders to his subordinates as they prepared for the major's departure. The machinery of war was reclaiming one of its own, indifferent to the human connections that had formed during his temporary absence from duty. Major Weber stood slowly, his movements still careful due to his healing wounds, but determined in their purpose. He looked back at the hospital building where he had spent the most meaningful weeks of his adult life, understanding that he was leaving behind more than just excellent medical care. The windows of the recovery ward caught the afternoon sun, and he could imagine the other patients continuing their own journeys toward healing in the sanctuary the nuns had created. Sister Marie Clare rose as well, the poetry book clutched against her chest like armor against the pain of separation. She wanted to speak words of encouragement, to offer hope for his future or promises about their potential reunion. But such statements would have been both inappropriate and impossible to fulfill. Instead, she simply said that she would pray for his safety, a pledge that carried deeper meaning than conventional religious courtesy. The Major's response revealed the extent to which their conversations had affected his understanding of faith and spirituality. He told her that he had never been particularly religious before his injury, but that watching her work and listening to her speak about her calling had given him new appreciation for the power of dedicated service to others. Her example had shown him that true devotion could transcend institutional boundaries and political divisions. As they walked slowly back toward the hospital entrance, both seemed to memorize details of their surroundings that would help them remember this moment in the difficult times ahead. The scent of blooming flowers, the sound of afternoon prayers drifting from the chapel, the warm stone of the ancient walls that had sheltered their impossible friendship. These sensory memories would become treasures to be examined and cherished when physical separation made other forms of connection impossible. Captain Muller appeared in the courtyard with an efficiency that brooked no delay. His presence immediately transformed the atmosphere from one of quiet intimacy to military formality. Major Weber straightened unconsciously, his posture shifting as he prepared to resume his role as a German officer, rather than a patient who had found unexpected refuge in enemy territory. The captain's assessment of his subordinate was thorough and professional, noting the obvious improvement in both physical condition and general demeanor. He commented approvingly on the quality of medical care the major had received, though his tone suggested surprise that French nuns could provide treatment comparable to German military hospitals. This casual prejudice revealed assumptions that both Sister Marie Clare and Major Weber had learned to see beyond during their time together. The formal transfer of custody proceeded with bureaucratic precision that reduced their meaningful connection to mere paperwork. Forms were signed, medical records transferred, personal effects inventoried and returned. The major's few possessions fit easily into a single bag, a reminder of how completely military service had stripped away the material anchors of civilian life. Sister Marie Clare stood with the other nuns who had gathered to bid farewell to their patients being transferred to different facilities. Her position in the group provided necessary camouflage for emotions that would have been inappropriate to display publicly. Yet Major Weber's eyes found hers in the crowd, and the look they shared conveyed everything that could not be spoken aloud in present company. The moment of departure arrived with the finality of a door closing on a chapter that could never be reopened. Major Weber climbed into the military transport with movements that had regained their strength but lost their enthusiasm. Through the vehicle's window, he caught one final glimpse of the convent that had become his refuge, of the garden where impossible conversations had bloomed like flowers in winter. Sister Marie Clare watched until the convoy disappeared beyond the convent gates, carrying with it a piece of her heart that she had never intended to give away. The other nuns dispersed to their afternoon duties, but she remained in the courtyard for several minutes, struggling to process the magnitude of what had just ended. The poetry book in her hands felt simultaneously heavy with meaning and light as air, a paradox that seemed to capture everything about their relationship. The days that followed Major Weber's departure brought a return to routine that felt both familiar and strange. The bed he had occupied was quickly filled by another wounded soldier, a young French partisan whose injuries required the same careful attention that all patients received. Yet Sister Marie Clare found herself noting differences rather than similarities, comparing this new patient's quiet stoicism to the major's thoughtful intelligence. Mother Superior Margarite observed these changes with the wisdom of someone who had guided many young nuns through various forms of spiritual crisis. She understood that Sister Marie Clare's experience with the German officer had awakened aspects of her nature that had been dormant during her years of religious service. The question was whether these new feelings represented a temporary distraction or a fundamental challenge to her religious vocation. The conversation they shared in the Mother Superior's office was conducted with the delicate balance of authority and compassion that marked all of the older woman's pastoral interventions. She spoke of the natural human tendency to form attachments during times of crisis, acknowledging that such connections were both understandable and potentially dangerous. The goal was not to deny or suppress these feelings, but to understand them within the context of religious commitment and wartime necessity. Sister Marie Clare listened with the respect due to her superior, but found herself struggling to articulate the nature of what she had experienced. How could she explain that her connection to Major Weber had felt not like a betrayal of her religious calling, but like an expansion of it? That caring for him had deepened rather than diminished her understanding of compassion and service, that their conversations had strengthened rather than weakened her faith in the fundamental goodness of human nature? The poetry book became both comfort and torment during the weeks following the Major's departure. Sister Marie Clare found herself reading passages that had been meaningful to both of them, hearing his voice in the verses he had recited from memory. The marginal notes in his careful handwriting provided glimpses into his thoughts and reactions that made his absence feel both more and less bearable. Her duties at the hospital continued with the same dedication that had always marked her service, but colleagues noticed subtle changes in her approach to patient care. She seemed to listen more intently to the stories wounded soldiers told about their experiences, to see beyond their injuries to the complex human beings who had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control. The empathy that had always been part of her nature had been refined and deepened by her encounter with someone who should have been her enemy. The spring of 1943 brought increasing tension to occupied Paris as resistance activities intensified and German reprisals became more severe. The delicate balance that had allowed the convent hospital to maintain its neutrality grew more precarious with each passing week. Reports reached them of other religious institutions that had been closed or taken over completely by military authorities, their personnel arrested or dispersed for alleged collaboration with enemy forces. Sister Marie Clare found herself thinking often about Major Weber's safety as news filtered back about increased fighting on various fronts. She had no way of knowing where he had been assigned or what dangers he might be facing, but her prayers included regular appeals for his protection and well-being. These spiritual exercises felt natural rather than conflicted, as if her concern for his welfare had become integrated into her broader commitment to opposing suffering wherever she encountered it. The other patients in the recovery ward represented a cross-section of the war's casualties, each bringing their own stories of loss and survival. Sister Marie Clare listened to these accounts with new understanding, recognizing in each narrative the same fundamental themes of people caught up in events beyond their control, struggling to maintain their humanity in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy it. A young German corporal who arrived in late age may reminded her powerfully of Major Weber, not in physical appearance, but in the intelligence that shone through his pain and confusion. He had been wounded during a resistance attack that had killed most of his unit, leaving him with survivor's guilt that proved more difficult to treat than his physical injuries. Sister Marie Clare found herself drawn to his case, recognizing in his struggle echoes of the Major's own crisis of conscience and identity. The conversations she had with this new patient lacked the depth and intimacy that had developed with Major Weber, but they served to reinforce lessons she had learned about the universality of human suffering. This young soldier spoke of his family's farm in rural Germany, of studies interrupted by conscription, of friends lost to a war that seemed to consume everything good and decent in its path. His story could have belonged to any young man of any nationality, a reminder that the uniforms that divided them were far less significant than the hopes and fears that united them. Dr. Dubois continued to observe Sister Marie Clare's evolution with professional interest and personal concern. The elderly physician had witnessed many changes in medical personnel over his long career, understanding that exposure to extreme suffering often transformed those who dedicated themselves to healing. Some became hardened by constant contact with pain and death, while others developed deeper reserves of compassion that sustained them through the most challenging cases. Sister Marie Clare clearly belonged to the latter category, her capacity for empathy having been expanded rather than diminished by her experiences. Yet, Dr. Dubois also recognized signs of internal struggle that went beyond the normal stresses of wartime medical service. Her attachment to the German major had awakened feelings and questions that would require careful navigation if she was to maintain her effectiveness as both nun and nurse. The summer months brought changes to the rhythm of life at the convent hospital, as the intensity of fighting in various theaters created new waves of casualties requiring treatment. The wards filled and emptied in cycles that reflected the broader ebb and flow of military campaigns, each group of patients bringing fresh reminders of war's human cost. Sister Marie Clare threw herself into this work with renewed dedication, finding in service to others a partial answer to the questions that had been raised by her encounter with Major Weber. The poetry book remained her most treasured possession, a tangible connection to someone who had shown her new possibilities for understanding and compassion. She read from it during quiet moments between shifts, finding in the familiar verses both comfort and challenge. The ideas explored by the poet spoke to universal themes that transcended the artificial divisions imposed by war, offering glimpses of a world where understanding might triumph over hatred. Sabai's autumn approached, and the war entered its 4th year. Sister Marie Clare had been transformed by her experience in ways that would influence all her future encounters with human suffering. The wounded German officer who had entered her life as a patient had become something far more significant, a catalyst for growth and understanding that would continue to shape her service long after their physical separation had ended. The letters began arriving in October, carried by a network that defied every logical expectation of wartime communication. Sister Marie Clare discovered the first one tucked inside a bundle of medical supplies that had been delivered by a Red Cross volunteer whose eyes held secrets she dared not question. The handwriting was unmistakably Major Weber's, though the return address bore no resemblance to any military installation she could identify. His words were carefully chosen, discussing literature and philosophy in terms that would seem innocent to any censor who might intercept them. Yet, beneath the surface of academic discourse lay messages that spoke directly to her heart. He wrote of reading Rilke under starlight, of finding unexpected beauty in landscapes scarred by conflict, of conversations with fellow officers who questioned the purpose of their continued service. Each sentence carried layers of meaning that only she could fully decode. Sister Marie Clare's response was crafted with equal care, her own academic background providing the vocabulary needed to discuss spiritual matters in ways that would not arouse suspicion. She wrote of her work at the hospital, of patients whose recovery had been aided by the poetry they had shared, of philosophical questions that arose from witnessing human resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. Her letters became a form of prayer, written to someone who had shown her new dimensions of faith and compassion. The correspondence developed its own rhythm over the months that followed, letters arriving and departing through channels that remained mysterious but reliable. Sister Marie Clare never asked questions about the network that made this communication possible, understanding that such knowledge would only increase the danger for everyone involved. She simply accepted this unexpected gift of continued connection, treasuring each letter as evidence that their encounter had been real and meaningful. Major Weber's letters revealed a man struggling with increasingly difficult moral choices as the war progressed. He wrote of orders that violated his conscience, of witnessing actions that contradicted everything he had been taught about honor and dignity. His unit had been transferred multiple times, each new assignment bringing fresh challenges to his ability to maintain his integrity while fulfilling his military obligations. The philosophical discussions they had begun in the convent garden continued across hundreds of miles, providing him with an anchor of sanity in a world gone mad. Sister Marie Clare found herself living for these letters, though. She was careful never to neglect her duties or display obvious favoritism toward this secret correspondence. She carried his words with her through long shifts in the hospital, drawing strength from his observations about finding meaning in suffering, about the possibility that individual acts of kindness could somehow redeem the larger darkness of their historical moment. The winter of 1943 brought news that made her hands tremble as she read his latest letter. Major Weber's unit had been assigned to the Eastern Front, where German forces were facing increasingly desperate conditions. His description of the retreat from Stalingrad was written with the detached prose of someone who had witnessed horrors that exceeded his ability to process them emotionally. Yet, between the lines, she could sense his growing despair at being part of a military machine that seemed to create suffering without purpose or meaning. Her response to this letter was the most personal she had yet written, abandoning the careful academic distance that had protected their correspondence from detection. She wrote of her prayers for his safety, of her belief that their meeting had been guided by divine providence, of her conviction that love and compassion were the only forces capable of healing the wounds that war had inflicted on human civilization. These words felt dangerous, even as she wrote them, crossing boundaries that had previously seemed uncrossable. The arrival of wounded German soldiers at the convent hospital took on new significance as Sister Marie Clare searched each face for signs that might connect them to Major Weber's unit. She questioned the conscious patients carefully, always maintaining professional discretion while seeking information about conditions on the Eastern Front. The stories they told painted a picture of military collapse and human misery that filled her with terror for the Major's welfare. A young lieutenant who arrived in February spoke of the chaos surrounding the German retreat, of units becoming separated and scattered across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. His description of officers who had simply disappeared during the confusion made Sister Marie Clare's heart contract with fear. The possibility that Major Weber might be among the missing haunted her dreams and distracted her during prayer. The letters stopped coming in March, a silence that felt more ominous than any bad news could have been. Sister Marie Clare waited through weeks that stretched into months, each day bringing fresh hope that the familiar handwriting might appear among the hospital's correspondence. She found reasons to speak with every Red Cross volunteer who visited the convent, searching their faces for signs that they might carry news about the network that had sustained her connection to the Major. Dr. Dubois noticed her growing anxiety and attempted gentle conversation about the dangers of becoming too emotionally invested in outcomes beyond their control. His words were kind, but clear in their implication that she was allowing worry to affect her professional performance. Sister Marie Clare accepted his guidance with appropriate humility, while privately refusing to abandon hope that somehow, somewhere, Major Weber had survived the destruction that seemed to be consuming everything in its path. The spring of 1944 brought changes to the war's rhythm that filled the convent hospital with fresh urgency. Preparations for what everyone sensed would be a decisive Allied offensive created new demands on their medical resources. The wards filled with wounded who spoke of increased resistance activity, of German forces being redeployed to defend against anticipated invasion. Sister Marie Clare threw herself into this work with desperate intensity, seeking in service to others some relief from the uncertainty that consumed her thoughts. The poetry book became her constant companion during these difficult months, its familiar verses providing comfort when sleep proved elusive. She had memorized many of the passages that Major Weber had marked as particularly meaningful, and she found herself reciting them like mantras during the most challenging moments of her work. The words that had once bridged the gap between their different worlds now served as prayers for his safety and well-being. A letter from Mother Superior Margarite's contact in Switzerland brought news that made Sister Marie Clare's world tilt on its axis. The International Red Cross had compiled lists of missing German personnel, attempting to account for soldiers who had disappeared during the chaos of various military campaigns. Major Hans Weber's name appeared among those classified as missing in action, last seen during the retreat from the Eastern Front in January 1944. The official notification felt both devastating and strangely liberating. Sister Marie Clare had lived for months with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing his fate. And while the news was not what she had hoped for, it provided a form of closure that allowed her to process her grief more completely. She spent hours in the convent chapel, praying for his soul while struggling to understand how their brief but profound connection fit into any divine plan she could comprehend. The summer of 1944 brought the liberation of Paris and the end of the German occupation that had defined so much of her recent experience. Sister Marie Clare watched Allied forces enter the city with emotions that mixed joy at freedom, restored with sorrow for all that had been lost during the dark years of occupation. The convent hospital began treating different kinds of patients as the tide of war shifted, but her approach to medical care had been permanently altered by lessons learned from a wounded German officer. The years that followed would bring other patients, other challenges, other opportunities to practice the expanded understanding of compassion that Major Weber had helped awaken in her. She never spoke publicly of their relationship or the correspondence that had sustained her through the darkest periods of the war. Some experiences were too sacred to share, too profound to reduce to simple narrative, too meaningful to risk diminishing through casual conversation. The poetry book remained on her bedside table until the day she died, its pages worn soft by countless readings, its margins filled with notes that tracked her own spiritual journey through the decades of peace that followed. Sometimes late at night, she would whisper verses aloud in the darkness, hearing in the familiar cadences an echo of a voice that had taught her new dimensions of faith and love during humanity's darkest hour. Young nuns who served under her leadership in later years often remarked on her extraordinary capacity for seeing beyond surface appearances, to the fundamental humanity that connected all people, regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. They attributed this gift to her years of experience treating the wounded, never suspecting that it had been forged during a few precious weeks when an enemy soldier had shown her that love could bloom even in the most impossible circumstances. The garden where they had shared their final conversation was eventually restored to its original purpose, flowering shrubs and herb beds replacing the makeshift seating areas that had been created for recovering patients. Sister Marie Clare tended this space with special care in her later years, finding in the cycle of seasons a reminder that beauty could grow from the darkest soil, that hope could survive the harshest winters. The connections formed in love were stronger than the forces that tried to destroy them. Her legacy lived on in the countless patients who received not just medical treatment, but genuine compassion from someone who had learned to see the sacred in every human encounter. The wounded German officer who had entered her life as a stranger had become her teacher in ways neither had anticipated, showing her that the boundaries between enemy and friend were far less significant than the bonds that united all who suffered and hoped for healing. The story of their impossible connection would remain hidden in the archives of memory, known only to God and to the hearts that had been changed by their brief but transformative encounter. In a world that seemed determined to divide people into categories of worthy and unworthy, their relationship had proven that love could transcend any barrier when it was rooted in genuine recognition of shared humanity and common need for grace. The decades that followed the war brought changes to the world that Sister Marie Clare could never have imagined during those dark years of occupation. The convent hospital gradually returned to treating civilian ailments rather than the broken bodies that warfare had delivered to their doors. Yet the lessons learned during those extraordinary years continued to shape every interaction she had with human suffering. In 1962, a young German businessman collapsed outside the convent gates, clutching his chest as a heart attack threatened to claim his life. Sister Marie Clare, now serving as head of the medical facility, supervised his emergency treatment with the same dedication she had shown to all patients. As he recovered in the same ward where Major Weber had once lain, she found herself studying his features for any resemblance to the man who had changed her understanding of compassion so many years before. The businessman spoke fluent French, but his accent carried echoes of Bavaria that made her heart skip in recognition. During his convalescence, their conversations revealed that he had grown up not far from the village where Major Weber had taught literature before the war. He spoke of the reconstruction efforts that had transformed his homeland, of young people who were building new lives from the ruins of the old, of a generation determined to create something better from the ashes of destruction. These conversations awakened memories that Sister Marie Clare had carefully preserved but rarely examined. She found herself sharing stories of the wartime hospital, though always in general terms that protected the privacy of individual patients. The businessman listened with the intensity of someone who understood that he was hearing testimony from a witness to history, someone whose experiences had shaped her into the remarkable healer she had become. When he was discharged several weeks later, the businessman left behind a donation to the hospital that was far more generous than his modest appearance had suggested. Attached to the check was a note expressing gratitude not just for the medical care he had received, but for the dignity and respect that had marked every aspect of his treatment. He wrote of sensing something special about the atmosphere at the convent, a quality of compassion that seemed to go beyond professional duty to embrace genuine care for the whole person. Sister Marie Clare kept that note in the poetry book that still occupied its place of honor beside her bed. The pages had grown more fragile with age, but the words they contained remained as powerful as ever. She often wondered whether Major Weber would have approved of the life she had built from the foundation of understanding he had helped establish. The question felt both impossible to answer and somehow unnecessary, as if their connection transcended the need for external validation. The 1960s brought social changes that challenged many traditional assumptions about religious life and medical practice. Younger nuns arrived at the convent with different expectations about their roles and responsibilities, some questioning whether the old ways of service were still relevant in a rapidly modernizing world. Sister Marie Clare found herself serving as a bridge between generations, someone who could honor the wisdom of the past while embracing innovations that might improve their ability to heal. During community discussions about the future direction of their medical mission, she often spoke of the importance of seeing each patient as a complete human being, rather than simply a collection of symptoms requiring treatment. Her words carried authority that came not from theoretical knowledge, but from decades of practical experience treating people from every background and circumstance. The younger nuns listened with respect, sensing that her insights were rooted in encounters that had tested and refined her understanding in ways they could barely imagine. A particularly challenging case arrived in 1968, when student protests in Paris resulted in numerous injuries requiring immediate medical attention. Among the wounded was a young German exchange student who had been caught up in the violence despite having no political agenda of his own. His injuries were serious but not life-threatening, yet he was consumed by guilt and confusion about his role in events he didn't fully understand. Sister Marie Clare recognized in this young man's struggle echoes of the moral complexity that had marked her conversations with Major Weber 25 years earlier. She spent hours listening to his questions about duty and conscience, about the difficulty of maintaining personal integrity in circumstances that seemed to demand choosing sides. Her responses drew on wisdom accumulated through decades of caring for people who had been broken by forces beyond their control. The student's recovery became an opportunity for deeper conversations about the nature of healing and the responsibilities that came with survival. Sister Marie Clare shared observations about the way traumatic experiences could either harden people against future suffering or open them to deeper compassion for others. She spoke of patients she had known who had transformed their own pain into tools for helping others, creating meaning from experiences that could easily have led to bitterness and despair. When the young German was finally discharged, he left behind a letter expressing gratitude for care that had addressed not just his physical injuries, but the spiritual confusion that had threatened to overwhelm him. He wrote of planning to study medicine himself, inspired by the example of healing he had witnessed at the convent. The letter joined the growing collection of testimonies from patients whose lives had been changed by encounters with compassion that went beyond the merely professional. The 1970s brought new challenges as the convent hospital adapted to changing medical technologies and evolving standards of care. Sister Marie Clare oversaw the installation of equipment that would have seemed miraculous during the war years. Machines that could monitor vital signs continuously and deliver medications with precision that exceeded human capability. Yet she never lost sight of the fundamental truth that healing required human connection as much as technical expertise. Training sessions for new medical staff invariably included discussions about the importance of seeing patients as whole persons rather than collections of symptoms. Sister Marie Clare would describe cases from her experience where recovery had been influenced as much by emotional and spiritual factors as by medical intervention. She spoke of the healing power of genuine attention of listening that went beyond gathering clinical information to embrace the full reality of human experience. A visiting medical professor from Munich arrived in 1975 to study the convent's approach to patient care, drawn by reports of unusually high satisfaction rates and positive outcomes. During his week-long observation period, he spent considerable time interviewing Sister Marie Clare about her methods and philosophy. Their conversations revealed that he had studied literature before entering medical school, a background that gave him particular appreciation for her emphasis on narrative and meaning in the healing process. The professor spoke of his own wartime experiences as a child, of growing up in the aftermath of destruction and guilt that had marked an entire generation. His questions about forgiveness and redemption revealed someone who was still processing the moral complexity of that historical moment. Sister Marie Clare listened with the same attention she had given to countless patients, recognizing in his struggle universal themes that transcended national boundaries or professional categories. Their final conversation took place in the garden, where she had once shared meaningful exchanges with another German visitor, whose impact on her life remained profound, though unspoken. The professor asked about the sources of her remarkable insight into human nature, the experiences that had taught her to see beyond surface appearances to the deeper needs that all patients carried. Her response was carefully worded, but deeply felt, speaking of encounters that had challenged her assumptions and expanded her understanding of what it meant to serve others. When the professor returned to Germany, he carried with him not just observations about medical techniques, but insights about the spiritual dimensions of healing that would influence his teaching for decades to come. His subsequent publications included references to a remarkable nun whose approach to patient care demonstrated the power of compassion to transform both healer and patient. These academic articles reached audiences across Europe, spreading influence that could be traced back to lessons learned during those extraordinary weeks in 1943. The 1980s brought changes to Sister Marie Clare's role as age began to limit her physical capacity for the demanding work of direct patient care. She transitioned into teaching and mentoring, sharing accumulated wisdom with younger medical professionals who would carry her insights into the future. Her lectures were renowned for their combination of practical knowledge and profound understanding of human nature, drawing audiences from across the medical community. During these teaching years, she often reflected on the mysterious ways that individual encounters could ripple outward through time to influence countless other lives. The wounded German officer who had entered her world as a patient had become, through their brief but intense connection, a catalyst for understanding that continued to shape her interactions decades later. She could trace direct lines from their conversations to insights that had helped hundreds of subsequent patients find healing and hope. The poetry book remained her constant companion through these later years, its familiar verses serving as both comfort and inspiration during quiet moments between duties. The marginal notes in Major Weber's handwriting had faded somewhat, but the ideas they represented remained as vivid as ever. She had added her own annotations over the years, creating a dialogue across time between two minds that had found unexpected harmony in the most unlikely circumstances. Students who attended her lectures often remarked on the depth of compassion that seemed to inform every observation she made about patient care. They attributed this quality to her years of experience, never suspecting that it had been forged in a few precious weeks when boundaries between enemy and friend had dissolved in the face of shared humanity. The lessons she taught about seeing beyond surface appearances to recognize the fundamental dignity of every person carried weight that came from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. A particularly gifted young doctor approached Sister Marie Clare in 1987 with questions about developing the emotional resilience necessary for a career in medicine. The conversation that followed revealed someone struggling with the same tension between professional detachment and human connection that had marked her own early years of service. Sister Marie Clare's guidance drew on decades of finding balance between these competing demands, offering wisdom that could only come from someone who had navigated such challenges successfully. She spoke of the importance of maintaining hope even in the darkest circumstances, of finding ways to honor the full humanity of every patient regardless of their background or condition. Her words carried authority that came from encounters with people who had tested and refined her understanding of what it meant to heal. The young doctor left their meeting with renewed sense of purpose, carrying insights that would influence his own approach to patient care throughout his career. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 brought back memories of division and reconciliation that resonated deeply with Sister Marie Clare's own experience of finding connection across seemingly insurmountable barriers. She watched television coverage of people celebrating in the streets, families reunited after decades of separation, former enemies embracing as fellow human beings. The scenes reminded her of the possibility for transformation that could emerge from the most hopeless circumstances. As the 1990s began, Sister Marie Clare found herself reflecting more frequently on the lessons that had shaped her understanding of healing and service. The world had changed dramatically since those dark years, when a wounded German officer had taught her new dimensions of compassion, yet the fundamental truths about human nature and the power of love to transcend artificial divisions remained as relevant as ever. Her legacy was already being written in the lives of countless patients who had received not just medical treatment, but genuine care from someone who understood that healing involved more than addressing physical symptoms. The young medical professionals she had trained carried her insights into hospitals and clinics around the world, multiplying the influence of wisdom that could be traced back to conversations held in a convent garden during humanity's darkest hour. The poetry book would outlive her, eventually finding its way to the convent's archives where future researchers might discover the marginal notes that documented one of the most profound encounters of the war years. But the true legacy of that impossible connection between nun and soldier lived on in the transformed understanding of compassion that continued to influence everyone who came within the sphere of Sister Marie Clare's remarkable ministry of healing. Healing. The story of Sister Marie Clare and Major Weber reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, when hatred seems to consume entire nations, individual acts of compassion can illuminate pathways toward understanding that transcend every artificial boundary we construct between ourselves and others. Their brief encounter in that Paris convent became a catalyst that rippled through decades, influencing countless lives in ways neither could have imagined. What makes their story so extraordinary isn't just the impossibility of their circumstances, but what it reveals about the fundamental nature of human connection. In a world determined to divide people into categories of worthy and unworthy friend and enemy, their relationship proved that love recognizes no uniform, no flag, no political allegiance when it encounters genuine suffering and responds with authentic compassion. The poetry book that passed between them became more than literature. It became proof that beauty and meaning can survive even when everything around us seems designed to destroy hope. The words they shared continue to echo through time, reminding us that the boundaries we think are permanent are often far more fragile than the bonds that unite us in our common humanity. Sister Marie Clare's legacy lives on in every medical professional who chooses to see the person before the diagnosis, every caregiver who recognizes that healing involves more than treating symptoms, every human being who dares to extend compassion across the lines that others insist must never be crossed. Her example challenges us to ask ourselves what barriers we maintain in our own hearts, what artificial divisions prevent us from recognizing the sacred in every human encounter. In a world that still struggles with division and hatred, their story offers hope that understanding is possible, that love can bloom in the most impossible circumstances, and that sometimes the most profound act of courage is simply choosing to see the humanity in someone we're told should be our enemy.